Hello and welcome to episode 55 of the Tax Professionals podcast. This episode is all about how to research a tax technical query.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Back in June of this year, I did a webinar with the ATT and CIOT's new Tax Professionals Committee, which is aimed at helping students or members of the ATT or CIOT who are in their first 10 years of their career. The webinar was centred around doing tax research, and there were two speakers, me and Dilpreet Danoa, a barrister for Field Court Tax Chambers. The webinar was hosted by Toyin Oyanayan and Michaela White of the new Tax Professionals Committee. My slot on the webinar was about 30 minutes long, and I covered how to research a tax technical query. We had good feedback on the webinar, so I thought it would be a good idea to share my section in this episode. And my section covers the starting point for tax research, credible resources, some tips and some warnings to help you when you're doing your tax research. You can access Dilpreet's section by going to the webinar recording, and there will be a link to that in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP55. Dilpreet's section covers much more of the legal side of doing tax research. She also talks about the process for doing tax research and a little bit about case law too. When preparing for this webinar, I had so much that I wanted to say about how to do tax research that I actually found it quite difficult to decide exactly what to include and what to omit from the webinar. I had to leave out an awful lot of what I actually wanted to say. And what it did make me realise is how big of a topic tax research actually is. And I actually wanted to go much more into detail and much further than I could have done in the time I had for doing the webinar. I pretty much wanted to share everything I've learned from my experience of doing tax research. I wanted to fully help tax professionals, particularly those in the early stages of their career, to develop the practical skills to undertake quality tax research, as well as being able to document their findings. I think that's because I personally believe that being able to do tax research is an important career skill for anyone that works in tax. But at the same time, I also know that a lot of people find it daunting. So on the back of this webinar, I've decided to develop a tax research masterclass, which is a work in progress as I'm speaking right now. The details are not finalised yet, but if you're interested in finding out more once the details are finalised, then you can register your interest by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TRM interest, and that just stands for Tax Research Masterclass Interest. So thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TRM interest. All the links that are mentioned throughout this episode anyway can be found in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP55. And this actually also includes a link to the supplementary tip sheet with a bonus tip that I created along with the webinar. The show notes also include a link to register for free access to some of Corona Eye's online tax resources and to obtain discounts if you or your employer or someone else would like to upgrade to their full resources. I've personally been using Corona Eye for about 5 years now in pretty much all of the tax research that I do. I find it a really helpful resource, particularly in being able to find the material that I want quickly. It's got up-to-date legislation, it's got up-to-date HMRC guidance, and it's also got up-to-date professional guidance that they provide as well. As I think a lot of us tax professionals do, I often get a tap on the shoulder from recruiters. From this and my recent experience of hiring a manager in my team, salaries for us are just skyrocketing. They just seem to keep on increasing and going up. If you're like me, and you're interested in knowing what you're worth in terms of salary, then you can get in touch with James from the tax recruitment company to benchmark what you're currently on. From his interaction with many different businesses and tax professionals, he has current knowledge of salary rates based on experience and specialism. You can contact James on 07768 252 252 at j.howell, that's j.howell at thetaxrecruitmentcompany.co.uk, or book a call with him via the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat to benchmark your salary or discuss potentially available roles, particularly if you work in corporation tax, as he is currently recruiting for many roles in this area. You don't need to remember James's contact details, They're all included in the details section of your podcast player and in the show notes. Without further ado, let's get to the episode.
Hello everyone, my name is Toyin Oyunayan. I'm the chair of the New Tax Professionals Committee. This committee is aimed at helping students and members of the ATT and CIOT who are in their first 10 years of their career. The committee hosts events on developmental skills, technical and topical matters, such as this event today. And our vice chair, Michaela Combs, will be your host for today. We hope you find this event useful. Over to you, Michaela.
Thanks, Toyin. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our Researching a Tax Technical Query event. Technical research is an invaluable skill in the tax world and one that becomes more and more important as you progress through your career. The aim of the event today is to provide some useful tips and tricks on how you can carry out your tax technical research. And we've got two great speakers with us today, Jack Bonehill and Dilpreet Danoa. Jack is an employment taxes senior at Danes Accountants and also hosts the Tax Professionals podcast, which some of you may be familiar with. The podcast provides free resources to help tax professionals progress through their careers and is available on various podcast players and via the Tax Professionals podcast website. Jack also sits on CIOT's Employment Taxes Committee. Dilpreet is a barrister at Field Court Tax Chambers and has a diverse international experience in representing clients at all levels of court up to the Court of Appeal across both indirect and direct taxes, as well as undertaking commercial litigation. Before joining Field Court Tax Chambers, Dilpreet worked in a private practice in the Middle East with a focus on international arbitration and litigation for commercial disputes and VAT matters. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Before we get into the main event, there are a few housekeeping points. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. As Jack and Dilpreet are going through their presentations, you can add in any questions you'd like to ask, and we'll go through as many of these as we can at the end of the session. The webinar is being recorded, so don't worry about scribbling down lots of notes. The recording will be sent out to all attendees after the session is finished. Now let's kick off the session with Jack, who will be providing some fantastic advice on how to approach research in a tax technical query. Jack, I'll hand over to you.
It's a pleasure to be here today and to be asked to do an event jointly with the ATT and CIOT New Tax Professionals Committee. So as Michaela kind of said, I'm an employment taxes senior manager and I also host the Tax Professionals podcast in my spare time as well. I'd just like to start my presentation with a little story from back in 2018. So it's 2018 and I walk into the revision class for one of my final CTA exams. And as I always do, I start chatting with the tutor. Would you say something to me about the use of the student forum that we get provided, which I just don't expect to say? Since I started working in tax, I've been very keen to gain the technical knowledge and just learn about tax rules generally. I've done a lot of tax research in my time, many times at work, and every time I get the opportunity, I take full advantage of this. I think I just really enjoy finding the information, piecing it together, discussing it with colleagues, and just all things tax. So I was really looking forward to doing the same thing with fellow CIOT, CTA students who are just as keen as me. So I've been posting on the forum to discuss technical points relating to the exam and also answering other students' questions too. But now I'm talking to my tutor and I'm surprised by what she says. I thought she was going to thank me for being so helpful on the forum, but that's not what she says. She says she's never seen a student respond to other students' questions before. So I was obviously in my own little bubble thinking that all tax students have the same enjoyment and opportunities as me when it comes to tax research, but obviously not. So I was completely wrong. It just turns out that I'm a bit of a tax nerd. So from your perspective, hopefully that's a good thing because today it means I can hopefully share some helpful tips to all of you about what I've learned about undertaking tax research and how to do it well, and particularly some things that I wish I would have known when I started out doing it because I kind of always fumbled my way along a little bit. But just an overview then of what I'm going to go through in this session. Very basically, what is tax research? I want to give a brief explanation of that, along with some common scenarios of undertaking research. I'm going to talk about the starting point when undertaking a piece of research. So what to do if you have no idea where to start and resources that you can use. And I'm also going to give my advice and tips and warnings, I suppose, around undertaking tax research just to make sure that you can do proper job. So what is tax research? So I think we've got a poll here just to start with that Michaela's just going to put on screen for us now.
Yep, brilliant. So the first poll is, how often do you need to carry out tax technical research as part of your current role? You've got 4 options: never, occasionally, often, or every day. So we'll give you about 30 seconds just to vote into the poll. Be interesting to see how often people are doing it at the moment. I know throughout my own career, it's varied a lot as I've gone on. Some days, certainly every day at the moment. Brilliant. So that's actually quite a good mix. So so about 54 of you often have to carry out tax research, which I think is quite, I don't know if you agree, Jack, but quite kind of representative of what I know of other people in the tax industry. 19% are researching every day. So this event will be quite useful for you, and 26% occasionally research. Brilliant. So I'll hand back over to you, Jack.
Yeah, to be honest, I was expecting it to be a lot less than that. I mean, could you imagine if it's 170 never do, and then we'll be a bit off, wouldn't it? Okay, so let's start then with what is tax research. So I think it's a bit of a technical term, but really it's just representing something quite simple. So to me, it's all about kind of searching for the relevant information and rules around tax, understanding and analysing those relevant rules to make sure that obviously you can apply it to the scenario you've got at work, whether that's a tax question on something very specific or whether you're just doing a wider piece of research. Taking that and also applying it, which I kind of just mentioned, and then also writing it up in some form so that it can be, I suppose, stuck on the file to refer to in the future, particularly if you're working with, say, a senior manager or something, or some colleagues, and you want to be able to show them all the research that you've done and explain to them the answer and what you found, etc., then obviously you need to be able to document it as well. So to me, that's kind of what tax research is in a nutshell. Well, as you kind of all know anyway, it seems like a lot of you, at least 50% of you, doing this often, so you have a pretty good idea what this is anyway. But to me, I would say those are all the key areas of tax research. And for those of you that have been doing tax research quite a lot, you probably already know by now that it's almost impossible to find an exact answer to the question that you have. You usually have to find out what the relevant rules are that apply to the situation you have, and then apply the rules to get the answer. But in some cases, of course, you will find an explicit answer if you've got a very, very simple question and straightforward question. Okay, so the common scenarios I see when it comes to tax research are where you get given a very specific question. Let's say a colleague or a client comes to you and says, is staff entertaining taxable, or is this staff entertaining event taxable? Something along those lines. You get given a very specific answer. And so therefore you can give a very specific question. And that's basically the main focus of what I'm going to talk about today, is tips and tricks, I suppose, of how you can do tax research in that scenario. So on top of that, I suppose more widely, sometimes you might get given a scenario. Let's say you're helping a business out with a due diligence because they're trying to sell their business, and you're looking at the whole employment taxes of the business. You will obviously establish all the facts that relate to that business first. Then you'll need to figure out what tax rules apply to it. So in that case, you don't have a specific question to start with, and that's a much more difficult piece of research to do, because obviously there's a lot of tax information out there. There's a lot of tax rules. It's almost impossible to know where to start. And whilst that isn't the focus of the session that I'm doing today, everything that I'm going to talk about is going to be directly transferable into that scenario as well. But it just requires a much more thorough, I suppose, methodical approach when you're working with that. Then on top of that as well, let's say clients come to you and they're looking for ways to save tax. I suppose it kind of links into the point I just talked about. But you might want to do some research to figure out, I suppose, how the client with the particular circumstances and facts that are in front of you, how they can, I suppose, change the way that their business is structured or the way that they do things to save themselves some tax. So I think this brings us on to the next poll now, Michaela.
Brilliant. So as a bit of a precursor to Jack's next section, where would you start if you had to research a query right now? So you're not sure, would you use Google, a tax guidance website such as Tolly's or Corona Eye, HMRC's own guidance, legislation, or another source? This will be quite interesting because I know when I started out in tax, I couldn't believe how many different avenues there were. So again, we'll give you 30 seconds or so just to answer. Brilliant. So again, quite a varied mix actually. So the most popular answer was tax guidance websites such as Tolly's or Corona Ice. That gave 39%. And then second was HMRC's own guidance. Third, Google, which I suppose is sometimes quite a common answer. And then 8% of people would use legislation, with 1% using another source. Great. So we'll hand back over to Jack to go through his next section.
Yeah, the 40 people that answered legislation, you're all my favourite out of this webinar. Exactly what I would do as well. And I know not many people start there because it seems like a scary thing to use, particularly because there's so much information. It's written in such an archaic and old way. So then, the starting point for research. So there's lots of different kind of points, I suppose, where you can start when doing your research. All the ones that were listed just in that poll are all great places to start. So I'm going to start off where your research is something that you have absolutely no idea where to start at all, which comes up now and again, particularly when you're less experienced. The more experience you become, I think you get a better idea of where you can find information that you want. But particularly early on in my career, I remember that I often had absolutely no idea of where to start. And I think just because of the generation that I'm from, inevitably I was going to start by using Google. Because Google's easy, you can type in obviously whatever question you want and it comes up with answers. But the problem with Google, as some of you may have already found out, is that literally anyone can post something on a website. And sometimes it's just as accurate as the man down the pub that's giving tax advice to his mate. It also can be out of date. It could be on a very particular scenario that hasn't been kind of well explained in it. So there's lots of risks, I suppose, with using Google overall. But as a starting point, it's great because it gives you a lot of information quickly, and it can give you, hopefully, some credible resources that you can then use to back up the findings that you've done through Google. So this is kind of, I suppose, my little diagram to just try and exemplify that a bit. So you can start with Google, be wary of it, and make sure that when you do use Google, that after you've kind of got your ground in your feet a bit, that you go on to find credible resources to back up that information. So I'll come on to credible resources a bit more later. If you do have an idea, which happens, I think, when you become more experienced and you've researched similar queries a lot before in the past, you'll have a good idea of resources where you can go to. So, and if that's the case, I always recommend that that's the starting point. It will save you having to kind of flounder around a bit on Google. It's going to reduce the risk of you coming to an incorrect conclusion, and it's just all around a good thing to do, in my opinion. So personally for me, when I'm doing research, if I can start on the legislation, I will always do that. And the reason I always do that is because that is obviously the law itself. And so I want to be able to read the law itself first before my view gets biased or tainted by HMRC guidance or some other guidance. I might come up with different things or have a different view to HMRC. I might have a different view to people who have written some professional guidance. So I think it's nice to go and get that perspective first and then challenge my own perspective with credible resources afterwards. So when it comes to credible resources, they're usually all structured in some form of way. So, for example, legislation is typically, when we're talking about primary legislation, is broken down into parts, chapters, and then sections. So if you have a familiarity with the different parts and sections, then you can usually flick straight to those in the contents page of a piece of legislation and then hopefully find the section that you want. It's very similar with HMRC guidance. And it's pretty much the same as well with professional guidance as well. They're all usually organised in a very nice way. So that's a good way to use credible resources as a starting point if obviously you know the credible resource to start with in the first place. So hopefully that all covers kind of the starting point. There's not really a you must start here. It will probably change on each piece of research that you do, but preferably always start with a credible resource. If not, use Google. I've got some tips that I'll come on to in a little bit as well about Google to help you to use that more effectively. This is my mad diagram of how tax research kind of works in my mind. I think you can start off with something that seems like a simple query. Every client comes to you and says, easy question or simple question or quick question, something along those lines. And we all know it never is. Because I think tax research looks a bit more like this. You start off with a scenario and you go down one route. So let's just take the staff entertaining example I talked about earlier. So I could start off by looking at whether staff entertaining is taxable or not. So I could go down route A. I might not find much because someone might use a different terminology to me. HMRC guidance might refer to it as business entertaining or hospitality or something along those lines. So I start branching off and getting all these different avenues that I could go down. I could look at staff entertaining, look at business entertaining, look at business hospitality, etc. So you kind of branched out into all the different areas. And then once you've kind of figured out what the right terminology is, you might jump somewhere else and realise that there's something like exemptions that might apply to stop a piece of staff entertaining being taxable. And you kind of keep going and keep going and keep going. You can end up looping back around and coming back to the start. But the key point really is that you need to be exceptionally thorough when doing tax research. I think if tax research hasn't taken you very long at all, you've either got a really simple query, which is great, or you haven't been thorough enough. One of the things I always say to my colleagues when doing a piece of research is, would you bet your house on the research that you've done and the conclusion? Would you bet your house that you're right? And if you're not, you probably haven't been through enough, so you should go back to it. So just some of the points then around this. So sometimes there's like closely related topics, which are different branches that you could start looking at and going down. There's definitions. So when it comes to legislation, a lot of words are given a very particular or specific definition. And if you just presume that it's got its normal English meaning, you can end up coming to the wrong answer. So you want to make sure that you thoroughly research every single definition. And if something isn't defined, you want to be confident that it isn't defined. You need to have done enough checks to make sure that there isn't a definition if that's what you want to conclude. You might also start in legislation, kind of as we talked about already. You then might jump to some HMRC guidance. You might start with Google. You might just keep jumping between all of them until you've kind of got enough information to know where you need to finish off. So I suppose bear that in mind. It's in almost all cases, I'd say you've got to jump around quite a bit, and that's not a bad thing. It's the right thing to do because it's an indication that you're being thorough and complete with your research.
Just a reminder to benchmark your salary, find out what you're worth, or discuss available tax roles. Get in contact with James at the Tax Recruitment Company on 07768 252 252 at j.howell@thetaxrecruitmentcompany.co.uk or book a call with him via the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. All these contact details are included in the show notes at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP55.
So credible resources. So we've kind of mentioned all these things already very briefly throughout what I've talked about so far. But the first credible resource is obviously HMRC guidance. So examples of HMRC guidance are HMRC manuals, notices like the VAT notices. And they kind of have some other guidance out there as well, which doesn't necessarily have a consistent kind of name like HMRC manuals do. And there's the generic kind of public guidance out there as well. I think it's written for people of quite a young age in a really simple way. I wouldn't recommend really using that guidance though, because it's so simplified usually that it's almost guaranteed that you're going to come to the wrong answer if you go down that route. Tax legislation itself. So this is my favourite credible resource, as I've kind of said, because I can jump in there, come up with my own interpretation without it being biased by other people's views and HMRC guidance first. So I know Dilpreet's going to talk about this a little bit more in hers, so I won't go into it too much, but really, from my perspective at least, there's kind of two key types of tax legislation. So there's primary legislation, which for me is basically only acts. For example, you have like the Corporation Tax Act 2010. You have the Income Tax Earning and Pensions Act 2003. They're both acts. That's primary legislation. And then you have statutory instruments as well. So Dilpreet will probably give a more legal definition of this later, but in kind of my simple way of thinking about it, the act kind of sets out the high level rules, and the statutory instruments usually fill in the details about how that actually works day to day with like processes and practices. I know it's not quite that simple, Dilpreet, so if you're feeling disgusted by that explanation of it, then I do apologise. Expert guidance. So there's lots of publishers out there that have expert tax people that write guidance on basically every area of tax that you can think of. So some typical things you might have come across are like the tax books that people write, such as like Tolley's books. or Bloomsbury Brooks. And nowadays, there's a lot of online digital kind of subscriptions that you can use. And these are all, I think, really great because for me personally, I'm able to find information much quicker using something digitally than I am a book. But I suppose whatever floats your boat, both of them are just as good, and usually they cover the same information. I know with Tolly's, I think they have all their books online now anyway, so you can actually choose which form that you want something in. So the last one I've got down here is case law. So again, I'm not going to go into this one in too much detail because I know Dilpreet is, but from my perspective, the benefit of case law is that it helps with interpretation of legislation. So if you've got something that seems ambiguous or unclear, and particularly if you're having some form of debate with HMRC, then case law is usually a good way to go down to find some case law that's relevant to the situation and the relevant tax rules that you have, that you can form an argument and back it up with something that's gone through the courts. So personally for me, I always start with legislation if I can. But if for some reason I don't know what piece of legislation that I need to look at to start with, then I personally use iCroner, which is an online resource. Because it's got a very good search function on there. And then if for some reason that search function isn't working, then I will revert to Google. Just as an example on the case law front, so one of the first times I did a piece of case law research was probably between 12 and 18 months into working in tax, when I got asked to look at some information around what HMRC can kind of ask for, what's HMRC's powers when they're undertaking an investigation. Because we had a situation where HMRC wanted to come into one of our clients' offices, stick a USB into their computer and extract loads of information from it. That is just a horrific thought for any business, I'm sure. And we were confident at the time that HMRC weren't able to do that. So off I went and I found what's called Schedule 36 notices and the legislation that's relevant for that. And then I found a bunch of cases that were specifically around Schedule 36 notices, so that basically I could see whether the scenario that we've got in terms of the USB being plugged into a computer, whether that's ever cropped up before and what the courts have already said in relation to that. So it was a long time ago since I did that research, but I seem to remember that we concluded that they couldn't, although I don't think there was a specific case at the time that covered it. There was things that were close enough to put an argument forward to HMRC, and HMRC then backed down after we did that. That's kind of the real benefit of case law with your research. The online resources nowadays as well, they tend to all have everything in them. So for example, Croner, the one I use, it does have up-to-date legislation. It does have up-to-date HMRC guidance, and it has their own guidance on top of it as well. So that's like 3 really good, credible resources within one resource. As part of the podcast, I've agreed with them that they can provide these free access to their weekly news updates as well. So if you're interested in that, then I think there's going to be some links sent around afterwards that will allow you to subscribe to that. Okay, so I think this is our third and last poll. Okay, then.
Yeah, I think, well, poll is one time. I think it's more of a pop quiz, this one. So is HMRC guidance the law? Yes, no, or not sure? So yeah, less of an opinion poll, more of a test. Right, so we've got 94% of people said no, 3% said yes, 3% said not sure. So I'll leave Jack to, I'll do a drum roll and give over to Jack to give the answer.
Yeah, I was going to say, whilst HMRC officers might think their guidance is law, in pretty much all cases, it's no. I think the only exception to that I can think of is within some VAT notices, there's some things that have force of law, and there's usually a box around that says this is actually law, but guidance is guidance, although a lot of HMRC officers seem to think that their guidance is the law. So let's move on to some tips and warnings then when doing tax research. So this will come as no surprise based on some of the stuff I've said already. And the biggest tip I can give anyone that's undertaking tax research is take your time. It's not an easy task to do, and it's exceptionally time consuming if you want to do a good job of it. And that's okay. I remember some of the first times I did some research at work, I thought, this is taking me ages. Surely they're expecting me to get the answer really quickly. But it's just not the case at all. I think we can get in our own heads a bit on that one, thinking that it shouldn't take us long. it should, like most pieces of research, would probably take at least an hour, and that's probably a simple piece of research. If you're doing something more difficult than that, half a day to a day, I would say, is very usual. Unless, of course, it's something that you've been researching all the time. You already know exactly where everything is, and you're just kind of touching up a little bit. Take notes as you're going along. So this will save you so much time actually when doing it. So particularly, again, when I first started doing research, I remember literally just reading a bunch of different pages and then thinking, what on earth have I just read? And then I had to go through and read them again. I also couldn't remember where I found some of the useful information that I wanted to use. So I had to keep going back. And obviously, if you go back and reread something, it takes time. Understand what you're reading. This one is super important, because if you don't understand what you're reading, how can you know whether you found the answer or not, or how can you apply the rules? So it sounds stupid, but I refer to a dictionary a lot. If there's a word that I'm not 100% sure, I know what it means in the context of like the sentence that I'm looking at. So be 100% sure to understand what you're reading, and if you're not, do something to make sure you do, whether it's do what I do, which is use a dictionary, an online one. Of course, I'm not from the 90s. And if you can ask a colleague or someone else, whatever it is, just make sure you understand what you're reading. And I mentioned this already as well. Don't expect to find an explicit answer. If you find an explicit answer, you've either been very lucky because you've got a simple question, or you're just not going to find one, essentially. Particularly when using online resources or anything digital, I use a Control F search a lot on what kind of keywords or buzzwords, something I'm working on. So coming back to the stuff entertaining example that I've been using throughout this, I could type in entertaining, I'll click Control F, type in the word entertaining, and then search a whole document or a whole page on the internet just to see if that word comes up. So just with the Control F though, just kind of one note is when you're doing searches on particular words, you just need to be flexible with the words that you can use. So I've already mentioned that what you might call staff entertaining, someone else might call business entertaining. So make sure you try a few different kind of variations of the same thing. Think of different ways that other people might be talking about the same thing as you. And it's not foolproof when you use Control F. Sometimes you're going to have to read a full document, but it's just usually helpful to try and jump to something quickly rather than read the full thing. Using Google, we've kind of talked about it should only be used as a starting point and kind of as a last resort. But when you are using Google, something called Google search operators can be really helpful to help you find stuff really quickly. So a search operator allows you to be more specific with your search. So my favorite two are what's called the search term operator and what's called the site operator. So if you put a word or a phrase within a double quotation marks like is shown on the screen, then you'll only find pages that use those specific terms in the order that you put them in. Site allows you to just search a particular site. So where I tend to use this a lot, for example, is because HMRC has really poor search functions with its manuals. I think I can never seem to find what I want when I use it. So I tend to find the website for the manual. So for example, here I've used the employment taxes manual and I've got the link to that. So I put the stuff that is here within Google. So the site that I wanted to search on, and then I wanted to search for car in this case. So this result basically returns everything that's within HMRC's employment income manual and everything that contains the word car. So the way you can get this link, by the way, is if you go into the first page of any manual, it will give you this link in your search bar, essentially. The way that HMRC's manuals work, at least, is whenever there's a page after it, they add an extra slash here, and then like some form of reference. So if you remove that, you've got the whole manual link. Just some warnings then quickly, just to finish this off. So you need to make sure that you're using up-to-date resources. There's so much out there that goes out of date and out of date very quickly because tax rules change yearly. So even like Tolly's tax books or credible resource, if it's in paper form, it's probably going to be up to date if it's more than a year old. This is a big one as well. Don't ever rely on a single sentence or paragraph in isolation. You need the full context. Now, that might be less so in legislation for the most part, but particularly when using HMRC's guidance, some of their sentences by themselves are quite confusing or don't actually lead you to the right answer. So I would say always read the full guidance. You need the full context. Do not rush, which we talked about already. Remember what's at stake. If you come to the wrong conclusion and you advise a client on the back of it and they end up not paying tax that they should have paid, there's undue tax. There's then, of course, interest and potentially penalties that can be there as a result. Do not presume the definition of a word. So particularly when it comes to legislation, as mentioned earlier, the specific definitions, and if for whatever reason you presume the definition of a word, you can end up coming to an incorrect conclusion. So just make sure that you're using the right. Make sure you find the definitions and make sure you're applying that particular definition. So that's the end of my section of it now. So I'm going to hand over to Dilpreet, but just to note, there is actually a summary of the tips and a bonus tip in relation to what I've talked about today, which I think is going to be sent round on a link at the end after the webinar. Over to you then, Dilpreet.
You can watch Dilpreet's section of the webinar by heading on over to the recording of the webinar. You can get a link to this in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP55. The show notes for this episode also include all the links and free resources mentioned within this episode, which includes a link to register your interest for the Tax Research Masterclass, which is something I'm creating to enable you to develop practical tax research skills. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful tips to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.